Hey, and I want to shift gears in this lecture to talking more about the mechanics of doing a fieldwork project, of traveling to a site and trying to learn about a culture. It might seem like a weird thing and not what you signed up for in a land tourism and culture class, but most of you are anthro majors and most of you are approaching graduation. And so I think it's good if you haven't had methods, haven't thought really seriously about how to do fieldwork, that you get familiar with it. I think if you've already gotten it in other classes, which you probably have, because we've got freaking awesome faculty here, that you get it some more. You really can't get too good at fieldwork as an anthropologist, since again, whether it's a year or more likely a couple of weeks, fieldwork's going to be something that most likely you'll be expected to do, or at least be expected to be familiar with. And so let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of a project. I had you do a reading. It's a reading actually by one of my former graduate students who now works for the Bureau of Land Management, Gabrielle Lukens. Lukens does really cool work. I really appreciated and liked Lukens's thesis, which I thought was just really well done in a lot of different ways. Can't really say enough good things about it. It's called Untrammeled by Man, an Ethnographic Approach of Outdoor Recreation Management in Sharon's Garden Wilderness. I selected this reading not only because Gabby's a former grad student of mine and a professional colleague, and I can make you read my colleagues' work, but also because it's a really good bridge between several topics in this course. We'll use it this week to talk about research design and doing a research project because Lukens does a good job of explaining her research methods and how she approached the project in the half of the thesis that you read this first week. And then next week, you'll read more about her findings, which is a really good segue into like nature tourism, since this whole thing is about a natural area that people go hike around in. So anyways, um, one thing, just one thing to note with her thesis before I go into kind of actual research design stuff, one of the things I liked that she did that I hope you will do, whether you're writing, let's say you're like working for an environmental agency or maybe an environmental activism group or an environmental nonprofit, and you need to do kind of what we call an environmental impact assessment, and more specifically a social impact assessment, where you're trying to understand the effect that like a logging operation or a mine will have on an indigenous people or a rural community. You're going to write that stuff up at some point, whether it's a report to your board or whether that's something that you guys are going to put into a press release, or whether that's maybe if you're working for the Park Service or the Forest Service or something, you're going to write it up as part of what we call the environmental impact statement. However you're writing it up, I think Lukens does something that we can all learn from, which is that she does a really good job very concisely of laying out the context of the site. So never get so focused on the people that you forget to talk entirely about the land, because the land is an important part of the equation of anthropology of land and tourism and culture. So she lays out the policies of the place, like this whole idea of the Wilderness Act. She lays out the number of visitors. She lays out kind of like what the site is and how it came to be a wilderness area managed by the government. Um, a little bit about the impacts and a little bit of like why they wanted the study done. That is a helpful thing for your, even if you don't have to send that into your employer because they might already know a lot of that information. It is helpful to lay out very clearly what the site is and what we're trying to learn about it right at the start, anytime you're writing something up. But anyways, I'm going to kind of draw on the Lukens reading several times as I go along, as well as a little bit on the Leighton Swan reading. But I'm going to kind of go through several stages pretty fast, and I would encourage you to feel free to pause and go back to these sections, since I will be covering them fairly fast, and or email me any questions you have. But I want to talk about kind of pretty briefly 8 different aspects of a research project. This is partly, again, just as I think it's good for you to get experience with research design in any class, right? We don't just want to give you content in a degree, we want to give you things you can actually do in a job. But not just that, but for this specific class, you're going to be doing a few different times. You're going to want to know how to design a research project. One is for the actual research project. I'm going to kind of want you to talk about a tourist site and how you would manage it, right? How you would stewardship it. And as part of that, it will probably be relevant for you to understand How would I get the information I needed to be a good manager or steward of this space? And many of you might find that as part of your final project, you need to describe kind of how you would do a ethnographic project at that site to better understand how to manage it. I want to give you a sense of what that would actually look like in real life. In the first test that you do, there's going to be a question related to how you would design a research project to try to understand tourism at a site. This kind of is going to kind of give you some of like what that might actually look like. I think I mentioned this before, but I've gone through this process several times. The first research I did on the Holy Mountain was kind of about not for tourism, it was kind of about the adverse negative effects of tourism on a native culture. But I later did another project with LDS tourists where the project was, and still is, it's ongoing, but where there was different stakeholders that were interested in on a more positive level on like why do people come to this site, what are they hoping to experience, how can we help them have a good experience, and from the perspective of the local host community, how can we make sure people keep coming because it's kind of an economic benefit for their community big time. So anyways, I come at this from the perspective of someone that's designed a few of these projects, and I'm not trying to be like, oh, I know so much, because I recently had to encounter a doctor who pulled that crap on me and was like, I've been doing this for 30 years, a medical doctor, and that was annoying and pretentious. So I'm not trying to be like, oh, I know exactly how you should design a research project, but I do have a little bit of experience with research design, and it's something I feel passionately about. So I want to talk you through kind of some of the things you would look at in general with any research project, and then I'll occasionally be like, and here's how that would apply to a project about a tourism location. All right, so first one is, so we're going to go through research design, defining research questions, picking your methods, entering the field, establishing your budget, anticipating chaos, additional considerations, and then exiting the field. So research design. When you hear the term research design, don't vomit. It's not as scary of a term as it means. It's basically the idea, though, of you need to have a sense of what you're doing with a project before you start it. Before, let's say you get hired by, to use my own work as an example, well, this isn't really what happened, but I'm going to fictionalize it a little bit. Let's say you got hired by like a city or something, and they're a tourist location, and they want to keep being a tourist location. That's an important part of their community. They get to show off some of their history and get some local, business for small businesses. So they like that they have these historic sites. And so they say, hey, um, you know, we are kind of a tourist economy, but less and less people are coming to our sites. Can you help us figure out what's going on? You're going to say, yeah, I can do that. And then you're going to want to go home, and you're going to want to get a piece of yellow pad of paper out or something, or maybe your tablet, and start doing what we call research design. Research design is the big picture. Let me figure out how to do this project. Now, inherently, this is always a bit of pie in the sky guesswork nonsense, because fieldwork is by its nature iterative. It evolves as it goes along. Part of what makes ethnography powerful is that we don't know what we're going to get until we get in there, and start spending time with people and getting to know their lives and their stories. And so you may find that your research goes a lot of different directions once you're on the ground. In fact, if it goes exactly the way you expected, you might want to question, did I maybe not actually find out anything that I didn't know before the project? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. So there's a certain amount of unpredictability in the process that's inherent and maybe even a really good thing, but it's still helpful to have a plan. I like to think of this like Bob Ross. Bob Ross is famous for his statements, we don't make mistakes, we make happy little accidents. And so he'll, mess up on a painting, on his old painting shows on public access. He would mess up on a paint thing, and then he suddenly turns that into a tree, right? Happy little accidents. But it's not as if Bob Ross starts the painting having no idea what he's going to paint. He obviously has a sense of where he's going with the painting, but he incorporates mistakes into his flow of what he's doing. A very Taoist sort of approach to it. I would hope we do the same with research design, right? Anticipate a certain amount of chaos, but you do need to have a plan, or else it's just going to be a bunch of random coloring lines on a paper, and you're not actually going to find out anything good about the tourist site or anything else. As part of research design, you're going to want to think about what your research questions are. Sometimes if you're applying for grant money, which we can talk about that more sometime, but if you're applying for grant money for maybe a nonprofit you're working for or something, they're going to want to sometimes, depending on who you're applying money for, they might sometimes ask for your research objectives or your research hypotheses, which if you're a cultural anthropologist, sometimes makes you want to throw up, because that sounds very positivist and like we're objectifying people or something. And it's not, it's language out of hard sciences that feels like a weird fit with social science. Um, But if you can reframe that in your brain, not as hypotheses about a culture, but instead just as research questions, things you want to know, knowledge you want to gain, um, I think that can be helpful. And I think research questions are incredibly important. And without that, your project will flounder. And with that, you can have a really good project. I've mentored a lot of graduate students on their research. And when you don't have good research projects, it tends to flounder. Um, they guide the endeavor. They distinguish research from just tourism because it can be easy to just go spend time in a place and kind of just lose yourself in it and be like, oh, it was so fun. I got to spend time around these historic sites. But it's like, yeah, but like what information did you get? Because you took time and probably you took money from someone, whether the government because you work for a land agency or a grant agency or someone paying you to do this. Like, did you find anything that they didn't know before? And to make sure that it's not just tourism, but it's actual research about tourism, you need to have good research questions, guiding questions. Now, as you have good research questions, you may develop two or three. You'll often find as you're in the field that sub-questions arise, things that relate to the main question but aren't the main question. For example, when I was doing my research with the Holy Mountain, I started to have sub-questions arise about the Navajo kinship system because people would refer to the mountain as like mother, and also people would sometimes say, oh, we have like relatedness to the mountain. So I then needed to do a bit of a dive into, well, what do Navajo people mean by ka'e, which helped that I worked for the tribal college. So a bunch of elders all the time were talking about ka'e with us. But that became a sub question and a pretty productive one. I also had sub questions arise about the protest scene, and to what degree the protests over the mountain were related to other protest groups. I got here like when they were doing a plastic bag protest. That ended up being more of like not a super useful direction to go and didn't super help me in what I was trying to write and find out about, which brings up the point that sometimes sub questions are rabbit holes that have rabbits at the end of them and are useful. Sometimes there's rabbit holes full of dirt, right? But you don't know until you start at least looking into it a little bit. So know that you're going to come up with big questions. I would encourage you to further break those big questions each into, let's say, 5 sub questions, and then recognize that once you're in the field, you're going to get more sub questions. And you do the best you can with the time that you have and the resources you have. And eventually, you got to just say enough is enough. I've found out what I can. I'm a human being with limited time and resources. I will come home and write what I have and see what I got. Cook the stew with what I got from the forest. Um, there's a few different ways to design your research questions, a few different models of how you come up with what you're going to try to find out. One is you can be driven by the literature-driven questions. If you go to grad school, especially not so much at University of Alaska Anchorage because we kick ass, but if you go to someplace, some less cool university that's more firmly rooted in sort of high and mighty academia, you might find that your professors beat you over the head with this idea of literature-driven questions and the idea that you're supposed to find gaps in the literature, which if you're a first-gen college student like myself from kind of more of a middle class to working class background, you hear that and you're like, what the crap are they talking about, right? Um, Part of what they're talking about is basically the idea of you need to find a um, question that hasn't been answered a bunch of times before. That's what they mean by a gap. So look at other studies of, let's say, Native American environmentalism, to use my research as an example, figure out what hasn't been asked before. Finding gaps, as they say, or literature-driven questions, very important for if you're getting a PhD, often if you're getting a master's and you're doing a thesis and you want to convince your advisor that you know how to do a good literature review. It can be really important for certain grants that want to see that want to know that they're contributing to the storehouse of scientific knowledge. So they don't just want to see you repeat something that's been done 30 times before. It's less important for actual applied work, right? The irony here is that some kinds of applied work, like an environmental impact statement on an archaeological site, right? You're trying to figure out what this site means to local people as a road is going in through potentially through the site. A lot of times the work needs to be done quick and well, and a lot of times the best way to use that is to use kind of a model of research that we already know so that we can make sure that we're not wasting a community's time as we try to get the best information possible to protect a site. So, spending 2 years trying to come up with the best literature question is not always very practical for some kinds of line of work. So depending on if you're more in academia and or getting a degree and or working for a very grant heavy nonprofit, versus maybe if you're working for like an activist group or your government group, literature may be super relevant to what you do, looking at other people's research, or maybe super not as relevant to find a gap in the literature. Um, Whether or not, though, you're finding gaps in the literature and trying to build theory and be fancy, your work should always be data in I say data there, I should have said literature. It should always be literature informed. You should always be using models that other anthropologists have come up with, whether or not you're expanding our body of theory and advancing scholarship of the human condition. You should still be drawing on what other people have come up with. You don't need to reinvent the idea of traditional ecological knowledge or the idea of discourse analysis and wilderness discourse, which is what Gabby Lukens was drawing heavily on. It makes sense to use concepts other people have come up with because that'll help you shed light on where you should be focusing your questions. So the literature can be helpful to look through. What have other people looked at? And then maybe sometimes you just kind of replicate what they did, but with a new group of people. But the literature can give you a sense of where should I be focusing? Because I can't study everything. That's impossible. A research question helps you narrow down to what you do want to focus on. It tells us where to start looking. Also tells us when we found something new, right? You start with a TEK concept and then you find out, oh, but then kind of like in the thesis, right, that you read, oh, there's this other thing about how like users have a lot of knowledge of the land, but they also like use that as kind of a point of pride to like show themselves as like people that have effectively become a part of the in crowd of the preserve. Right now, you know that you're finding something interesting. So knowing the literature is helpful, even if it seems a little bit high and academic. But that's one kind of research question you could ask, is a question that's rooted in the literature where you're trying to advance the science. You could also ask questions that are community-driven questions, which of late has tended to be where more of my research, well, it just depends. The tourism project up in New York tends to be pretty literature driven. The tourism, some of the work I'm doing down here on the peninsula is more community driven. It's what is the community telling you are questions they would like to know about. And when that happens, when, for example, if this hypothetical tourist community approaches you and say, hey, we have a historical site, people aren't attending, we want to know why they're not attending, and we want to know what we would need to do as far as signs to make our community more palatable to tourists. Now, you and your brain might be like, well, that's not fun and exciting. I don't want to research signs for heaven's sakes, or tourist motivations. And I would advise you to check yourself, both because the community might be paying your bills, so there's on a practical level, but on a much more important ethical level, when we are a guest in a community, I think it's a really good thing to actually study what that community is actually interested in. There's a great essay by Vine Deloria, the Lakota author, who was the grandson of a Lakota anthropologist, Ella Deloria, and Vine wrote a article called Here Come the Anthros. And it was written back in the 60s when anthropology was very different than it is nowadays. But he laments how often anthropologists would come into the community and research what they found interesting, go home and write a book about it, and not really help Native communities. So I would encourage you, whether it's a Native community or not a Native community, that when your community is hosting you, that you really try to listen to what they think is interesting. It doesn't mean it's the only questions you ask, but it should be some, if not a strong part of the questions you're asking, for ethical reasons as well as practical ones. And a lot of times what you may find is that as you follow the leads that people on the ground have that have been living there their whole lives, they will often lead you in directions that end up being fascinating to what you're interested in. And you get this beautiful sort of synthesis and synergy. I hate that word because it's been co-opted by business. But anyways, this beautiful synergy when your interests and a host community start to really blend together. And I think that happens because you're starting to find stuff that actually matters and is actually real about the human condition in that place and time. Um, you know, by the way, sometimes when you're getting questions that a community is supplying for you, sort of like, look at this, you might find that there's stuff that you can't do. And you have to be honest about that and say, I do interviews and observations and stuff. I can't like analyze what the economic impact of this tourism declining is going to be. I'm not an economist. You need to hire someone else for that. Or you might say, I mean, I can do my best and kind of try to look at some numbers, but it's really not what I do. So it's good to be honest when you're getting your questions from the community, because they may or may not understand exactly what it is that you can bring to the table. Finally, another way that you can get questions in a research project that you can figure out what you want to learn about is just by going, it's going to sound super kumbaya, weird, hippy dippy, but sometimes it's just by going with what speaks to your gut, what speaks to your soul. The first project I got going on because I heard about an issue with the Sacred Mountain and I got pissed because it reminded me of some things I'd experienced as a kid, um, which were very, very different and not at all relatable to the Sacred Mountain thing, but it just touched something in me. Where as a human being, the idea of cultural difference and especially differences around holy sites, it made me like, oh man, it kind of touched me somewhere. And I was like, I want to go down there and get involved. And so sometimes our research questions are driven by our own passions and interests, and that's not always a bad thing. Um, in Lucans's case, she talks about she was looking for a project, and I know this because I was her grad student advisor. Um, she spent some time hiking up in the woods up there, a place a few hours from where she was going to grad school, and she started to really like this space and meet some of the people involved with it, and then it turned into a project, right? So sometimes following your nose, so to speak, following the things you're passionate about. Um, this isn't like manifesting or something like that people talk about on TikTok. It's more just like on a practical level. When people can tell you're excited about a topic, um, they often kind of put you in the right direction of like other people that are excited about the topic. Suddenly you're talking to a park ranger that's into the same thing, and suddenly you find a project that's a really good project. So all three of those are good ways to approach questions: looking at what's already been done, looking at what the community wants, or just looking about what feels exciting to you. All three of those can lead to good questions, but you need to have a good list of questions before you go to the site. For example, Gabrielle Lukens defined hers as: the goal of the project is to understand wilderness users' experiences, perceptions, and behaviors within Sharon's Garden Wilderness Area relative to the legal designation of wilderness areas and the associated wilderness characteristic management are obligated to project. I think that should read protect. Um, this is a great formulation of a research question. Now, what you actually look at is probably always going to be a little bit bigger than your actual questions. You need to narrow it down enough so that you have a focus. Once you're there, it may balloon out from there, but have a focus. It doesn't have to be so narrow that it's boring, but not so broad that nobody knows, including yourself, what you're actually looking at when you get there. You need a starting point, and that's what research questions provide. Um, when we're talking about anthropology of tourism, when you're trying to understand a tourist site, one way to think about research questions might be to think back to that Leet and Swain reading that you did. They talked about the idea that for anthropologists, tourism is not a single thing, but includes multiple actors with differing power, such as tourists, workers, residents, different practices such as sightseeing, photographing, shopping, and constituent institutions like agencies and airports and hotels. And basically, if I was to make that quote simpler, I would just say people, practices, places, right? You can ask questions about the people involved in a tourist site. So back to this historic community that I'm making hypothetical for you. Maybe they're like, hey, anthropologist, recent graduate, we want you to figure out what's going on with our tourism situation. And you could say, cool, I'm going to start by looking at the interaction of people, right? Hosts and guests. What is that like when people come to your town? So that's giving you a research question by thinking about the people involved, or you can think about the practices involved. Okay. So you think, what do people do at this site? Okay. They take pictures and they read signs. Okay. What is that? So maybe I ask myself, what is it they take pictures of and why? And what's that experience like for them? And then places or processes, right? Institutions. So you might ask, okay, well, I noticed that you guys have kind of this like hotel industry in town that's designed to accommodate these tourists. Like, what's that look like, and to what degree is that tied in with your historic site? So by looking at people's practices and processes or places, you can start coming up with some really good questions about any tourism site. In the reading, they also mentioned a bunch of things that other people have looked at, and these are all like areas that we've done research in tourism and found that ethnography works well. So when you're answering, let's say, a test question, and they're like, hey, somebody's hiring you to study a tourist site, you might say, well, here are some of the kinds of things I might look at. Things like the experiences of the tourists, the motivations of the tourists, what the tourists think they're going to see when they get there, their expectations, branding and how places choose to present themselves and how tourist agencies present them, and how governments present sites, culture, and all these issues with how do cultures represent themselves, how do their identities get commodified or turned into a product that other people can consume, impacts of the tourism. These are all areas where we've done a lot of research, and that's if you're trying to figure out how would I come up with a good research question for a site like this, look at this list, right? And you've got a bunch of ideas of like things you could look at. All right, I'm going to pause there.